Welcome to our panelists that are online. Now, the topic of tonight's discussion is what is theory? And it is the anniversary panel of the two doctoral events that EIBA has hosted. And let me see if I manage to change the slide here. So, the two doctoral events that actually have an anniversary year this year. So we have the John Dunning doctoral event with which Professor Jean-François Hénard is associated. And then we have the 10th anniversary of Danny van den Bulke Doctoral Symposium, for which I thank Professor Jeremy Clegg at the University of Leeds, who has been a key figure in this event. Now, tonight with me, I have Professor Ruth Aguilera from Northeastern University. And then I have Professor Mark Casson at the University of Reading, whom I can't see, but I hope he's with us. We have Catherine Welch, and she's at the University of Sydney. And those who know the differences in time zones know that it's very early in the morning. So thank you everyone for being here with us tonight. Now, theory is a topic that is at the heart of academia. Doctoral students are expected to make a contribution to theory, and editors and reviewers may reject a paper on the grounds that it doesn't sufficiently contribute to theory. So theory, as Corley and Joya have said, is really the currency of academic business. The background of this panel tonight is that the question of what is theory is rarely posed. It is a concept that we often take for granted. And actually, when teaching PhD students, one gets the impression that we actually don't have words to discuss and debate theory in our field. Interestingly, when we stop and reflect on this topic, there is a persistent assumption that in IB, theory should be generalizable. It should be context-free. But at the same time, the very essence of our discipline is actually to understand and explain how differences across context affect business. And this tension between our understanding of what theory is and how we relate to context is intriguing. We are also fortunate to be in a field where we have colleagues from different traditions, different disciplines, different trainings. And this means that there's also a diversity of views of what theory stands for. So tonight then, the purpose of this panel is very much to initiate a debate, a discussion about what theory is in our field. Now, the purpose is not to reach a consensus, but rather to show and open up the diversity of meanings that we associate with theory. And not to say that Ruth's view is better than Mark's or Jeremy's, but rather to show that there is difference. And this, we hope, will allow us to have a more constructive, more developmental discussion, positive discussion about what it takes to make a theoretical contribution in our discipline. So I will say a few words here at the beginning to problematize the notion of theory. And then I will ask Mark, Ruth, and Catherine to present their view of theory, perhaps their favorite definition of theory. Then I will introduce to you one real-life reviewer comment and ask you to tease out assumptions of this reviewer comment. Let's see how it works in this big auditorium. And then Ruth and Catherine will show one example of a type of theory that you may or may not be familiar with. And Jeremy and Jean-Francois will take us on a journey how to work with theory across contexts. And hopefully within an hour, we will have some time for your questions. Now, there's actually a book called What is Theory by Korvelek, an edited volume. And he starts the book by saying that the question we raise in this panel is a very challenging question to answer. It's challenging even for senior academics, let alone students. Abend has identified 7 different meanings of theory. And in this quotation, you can see that the meaning of theory is actually a contested term, in a sense that we may have value judgments about what is a better kind of theory than another. We know that in universities, some disciplines are categorized as hard disciplines, others as soft, and deans may allocate resources based on the expected contribution to science. When we talk about theory, we may have an image of the theory as prediction, as regularities in the social world. Or we may think that theory is definitely about explaining an event, explaining how things have unfolded. Or somebody might say, no, I totally disagree. Theory for me is understanding, and understanding something from the viewpoint of the people who are living the phenomenon. And the fourth person might say, you're all wrong. Actually, theory is about giving voice to marginalized groups, those whose voices we rarely hear. It's about emancipation, it's about activism. So here you already see a range of meanings. And let me add a 5th one. Barroway, who is a critical scholar, says that without theory, we are blind. We cannot see the world. And he's saying that in order to navigate in the complexity of the social world, we need theory that simplifies our environment, that gives us some certainty. And he also suggests that practitioners may equally well have theories. Theories are not limited to academics. So let me stop here and ask Mark to start the discussion and present us with his view of theory. Is Mark there? I can't see him. Well, then I will give the word first to Ruth, and let's see if we get Mark. Yeah. Please.
Mine is going to be very short. Let's see. Yes.
Yes.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here at the end of the day. I know we all had a very full day since 8:30 this morning. I also wanted to thank, on behalf of the entire panel, Rebecca, who coordinated us, and we did some background work on this panel, which it might not show up today, but we have done some thinking about this. My name is Ruth Aguilera, and I have a PhD in sociology. And I'm also the AMR associate editor, and I kind of handle a lot of the international business papers. So I just wanted to kind of do a shout out that we have a program that is really excellent, which is called the Bridge Reviewer Program, where you can sign up and just kind of shadow the whole process. So just kind of that out there. I'm not going to take a lot of your time, but I like to share with you something that has been very useful for me to think about theory. And Rebecca has already pre-shadow it a little bit, because I think theory is a simplification and capturing the simplification of the world. So I really like this definition that I stumbled upon when I was a PhD student, so a long time ago. And this is the definition. So I'll read it for you. So a theory is a statement of relations among concepts. So here, very key, the word concepts, within a set of boundary assumptions and constraints. So you have to set those boundaries. It is no more than a linguistic device used to organize a complex empirical world. As Hall and Lindsay pointed out, the function of a theory is that of preventing the observer from being dazzled by the full-blown complexity of the natural and concrete events. Therefore, the purpose of theoretical statements are twofold: to organize this complex world into some sort of parsimonious way, and then to communicate clearly. So these are two things that they are super important when you write theory, and this is by Bacharach, AMR 1990. Another thing that I wanted to throw, this is the second and last slide to see if Mark is coming. Well, Cornelissen, Holler, and Seild in the recent organization theory journal just published also different ways of explaining and defining theory that are useful: propositional, configurational, process, perspectival, meta-theorizing, theoretical provocation, and critical meta-theorizing. So this is something for you to look at if you're interested. And finally, you know, when we think about theory, many times we think, where is theory coming from? Like, where do we get it? And I think it's also useful to think about, is this an inductive theory? Like, you drive the theory from the data? Is this deductive theory? And now the new thing seems to be this abduction, which is a combination of both, going back and forth between empirical theory, and it's very much something that we do also in configurational thinking. So I'm going to stop there, since we have very limited time.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you so much. And let me then invite Catherine to present her interpretation of theory. Please, Catherine.
Yes, good morning from Sydney, everyone. Now, the interesting thing about joining online is I can't see the audience, so I'm assuming you're there. So hello to all of you, even though I can't see you. And hopefully you can see my screen. Rebecca, can you see my screen?
Yes. Would you want to put it in the full presentation mode or keep it like this?
I'll put it in full presentation mode if you see it. So hopefully everyone can see this. So Ruth mentioned her disciplinary background. I'm going to take a slightly different tack, because I'm going to address this as a qualitative scholar, and qualitative researchers, as you know, have many different methods that they use, but they also have different theorizing traditions. So I'm not going to present one definition, I'm going to present three. And it relates actually to the table that Ruth very briefly showed to you, because qualitative researchers span quite a lot of those traditions that she just put up on the screen.
Catherine, can you stop for a minute? There is a lot of echo in the voice, in the sound. Do you hear the echo, or can you hear Catherine well? You can hear well. Okay, it's just here in the front then. So please go on.
Okay. Yep. So the first definition is actually not, interestingly, a qualitative definition. It's broader than that, but it's one that a lot of qualitative researchers use. and that is theory is a form of explanation, and it's a particular form of explanation. It's looking at the why. It's looking at why certain events occur or have occurred. So that's the first point. And it does so by looking at connections, and again, particular types of connections. In other words, causal chains of events. So that's the first one. Now, it's important to note that this does not necessitate prediction. So you can have explanatory theory, but without necessarily claiming to predict the future. So that's the first one. I've got some alternative definitions. I've presented the first one because it's the one that probably most qualitative researchers in international business would relate to, but I've got two others. So the next one is using the word that Rebecca just mentioned, understanding. So a distinction is made between understanding versus explanation. And really, it's because even though connections are sought, it's connections from the part, the phenomenon that you're looking at, to the whole, to the context. And in doing so, you elucidate meaning, which is not on the surface, but something that you really need to dig for to understand. And in doing so, you provide an understanding of the phenomenon which otherwise would not be possible. So that's really another tradition of theorizing, which is related to interpretive work. So it's the interpretive tradition. And then the other one you can see really denies the notion that we come to research and we come to theory as neutral observers. Instead, theory is always for someone and for a purpose. We always come to the world with a particular standpoint, and theory always has a perspective behind it. It is ideological in nature. So this is a critical tradition of theorizing, not represented very often in international business, but it's an important tradition amongst qualitative researchers. So I've tried to represent the diversity of qualitative research with a diversity of definitions, but I also want to say that there are more than just three, but these are three important traditions that really have influenced qualitative researchers. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Will you maybe stop sharing the screen? No? Yes. Oops. Where did I go now? So we have already seen a set of different definitions. Why do they matter? Well, they matter because people actually evaluate each other's work very much based on the assumption, the understanding that they have of what theory is and what it should be in terms of making a contribution to our field. So I would like to present to you a quotation that a colleague shared not too long ago, a reviewer comment that she received. And I'd like to ask you, what is the understanding that the reviewer has of theory? That might be revealed if you read carefully the quotation. What is the assumption that the reviewer conveys here? And this was based on a multiple case study, an empirical paper that had 4 case companies. Any volunteers who would like to? I can read it out, sorry, it's small. So the reviewer is saying, you have a sample of 4 firms, a sample in a in a matrix of four firms, and there's one company in each quadrant. The reviewer says, this sample of four firms doesn't allow for any variance in your analysis. I suggest that you find 2 to 3 more firms in each quadrant so that you could account for some variance for the sake of some generalizability. Then you may be able to develop a strong case-based study. Jaime, please. So yes, so to share your view, thank you, Jaime. So there is this assumption, sort of the more the better, and that we should aim at having findings that generalize across a population, although we know that cases are not selected randomly, but they are often selected based on theoretical arguments. So here you see a tension between what the reviewer says and what the author is requested to do. But let's leave that aside, and I will next ask. I could ask Jeremy now to share his view of theory and the way he works with theory. Jeremy, please.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. You will need to blow up have the speaker view when I do this. So I'm just going to get into the mode now of sharing my screen with you. And
this is high tech.
No, it's not. But I presume we're on some sort of a big screen or something, aren't we, at the moment? Is that right? Yeah, I guess so.
It's not this.
All right. Okay.
No, they're doing it. They took control.
All right.
Yes.
So now.
Yes, perfect.
All right. So I'm yes. Okay. Hang on just a second. Right. So how big do you want me? And hopefully not too big. All right. Hopefully that worked. Right. Okay. So you can see me and you can see the presentation. That's the important thing. All right. So
Jeremy, speak slowly.
Oh, speak slowly. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was Ruth, I think, wasn't it? Thank you. All right. So 5 minutes. 5 minutes. So working with theory across contexts is what I was asked to talk about today. And it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you very much indeed for inviting me, Rebecca. And I'm sorry I can't see the audience, but it's a wonderful thing, and it sounds like a very big auditorium. So we must be very important today, which is great. So we were asked a number of questions. First was, what is theory to you? And it was the fourth one, in fact, we were asked. So I skipped 2 and 3. How can we seek common ground across the different perspectives and the disciplinary traditions? So let me try and address that, and I think possibly address some of the issues that have already come up in some sort of a way. For me, this is the definition that I like, and it comes from the Oxford English Dictionary. It's from the concise one, which gives you the simple one, which is the general purpose one. It's a supposition or a system of ideas intended to explain something, especially one based on general principles, independent of the thing to be explained. And it's a set of principles on which an activity is based. For me, in that simple Oxford statement, tells me that we are beavering, which I'm afraid is colloquial. It means we are working. Each of us is working on one or more aspects collectively of that definition. So that's the scientific process. And what I see as the problem in the reviewer comment that you presented just then, Rebecca, which I was going to joke that was a reviewer comment I did a few years ago, but I'm just joking, it wasn't mine. In that is encapsulated within the OED definition. The assumptions is the supposition. The process of theorizing is the intention. That's the design process. The output is the theory, and the output is the system of ideas and the general principles. And the choice of the thing to be explained is the choice over where you're going to apply your theory, the generality of the theory. And then finally, the use of those principles as a basis for action, which is the activity in the definition, which could include prediction. So for me, it's all in there. And that is a definition that's short enough I can remember. So the choice of the thing to be explained over the generality of the theory. And what I've been asked, and Jean-Francois, I've been asked to talk about today, evaluating the theory in new places. Evaluating, in this particular example, the Western standard model of outward FDI determinants on Chinese data. The justification for doing this, and there has to be a justification, China and the emerging economies spawned and are still spawning outward FDI, but most importantly, the Chinese MNEs are ostensibly, it means that they are definitely competing with Western counterparts. So therefore they qualify as being the same class of observations. In other words, we're actually identifying a place on the basis of some rational explanation as to where we might reasonably expect our theory, which we already have, to apply. And so therefore it's a sensible place to test it. We're extending in the 2007 paper, which I didn't emphasize, but that's the 2007 paper, which was in the retrospective, covered in the retrospective as well in the Journal of International Business Studies. We're extending theory, known theory, to the Chinese context. And here's a quote from that retrospective. We began our endeavor to test a standard model of Chinese outward FDI and of determinants of FDI on Chinese OFDI data in the knowledge that we could be certain that China was the ideal test pad for our inquiry. In other words, it was a new place. It had never been tested before, and we knew it would be interesting. So Chinese FDI, this is not a discussion of the empirical aspects, that's the data period, 1984 to 2001. And most of the FDI then was state-owned, and still a lot of it is. The research findings, which I'll just alight upon the interesting ones. These are the standard model was confirmed for market seeking, resource seeking. Strategic asset seeking was not, which is interesting and I think worth further attention. But public policy change, by which we mean today international business policy, emerged as having a positive influence on OFDI. Interesting from today's perspective. Cultural proximity, positive influence. Chinese OFDI, however, exhibited a perverse positive response to high levels of risk. And this is our exciting finding. And there was a bonus proposition, which Peter cooked up, that imperfections in domestic capital markets could be an explanation as well. And that is something we didn't test, but it's something that's worth testing and worth thinking about. And that gives us a research agenda, all of the above, on state-backed capital, which I've tried to do something about. Over the last 2 years, it's not been so easy. So our research agenda, we propose from that 2018 paper, we propose research challenges for the next decade on Chinese OFDI that transcend the Chinese context. Yes, in other words, going further outside of the Chinese context alone and for wider and theoretical applicability. And our takeaway, my takeaway, is context is king or queen, and contrasting social, economic, industrial, and political structures is perfect for testing known theory in different places. But for me, justification is paramount. If you're going to test in new places, you have to have a rational argument for why you're doing it. You can't apply something from some place to another crazy place. And if that's satisfied, then the research itself should have value. And potentially we might even, the Holy Grail, contribute back into those disciplines that we use within international business. So the research agenda generation comes out of this process, and we're all in some part of that process. And we should be generous and realize that we are all part of that general theoretical scientific movement. New theoretical directions or new theory may result. Theory will become more general, more high level, but we will never run out of context, and we will never run out of new places to test our existing theory. I end there. I finished.
New empirical context, and that this meeting of theory and data is a two-way meeting, as Jeremy so vividly illustrated. Let me then invite Jean-Francois on the virtual podium, and after that I will turn to you for a question or two. So Jeremy, will you let Jean-Francois share the screen? Thank you. Jean-Francois, over to you.
Good evening, and thank you, Rebecca, for inviting me to say a few words about theory. So I have actually been a practitioner of theory in the sense that I started my academic career in my 1977, yeah, that's a long time ago, a PhD thesis on the transaction cost theory of the multinational enterprise. And most of my career actually has been spent developing what I hope are useful theories. So to me, a theory has a number of characteristics. The first one is that it should be simple and intuitive. So when you read about a theory that is really excites me, it's typically very concise, very simple, but also immediately you see the applications outside the field in which the theory has been developed. So a theory, I think, should have falsifiable predictions, and it has to have falsifiable predictions outside the specific area in which it was invented. So let me give you an example to that, which is just like the previous example of Jeremy, talks about a Western theory, or in this particular case, a very American-based theory, which is Williamson's version of transaction cost theory, can actually account for phenomena such as guanxi or relation-based governance in general in China. So Williamson's theory is very American in the sense that it emphasizes what can be called rule-based governance, and that is the enforcement of transaction through contracts, through the writing of contracts, and those contracts being enforced through either courts or arbitrators, that is third parties. So to really understand, to have an idea of a more general theory than this very much context-based theory, you have to ask yourself, why is it that countries like China can do, or more generally countries outside the US, or more generally countries outside the Anglo-Saxon sphere, can actually manage to enforce transaction without contracts and without recourse to courts. And the first thing to understand is what are the limits of enforcing relationships or enforcing transactions through writing contracts and through the courts. One of them, of course, has been discussed in length by Williamson, and that is to be able to protect yourself against potential opportunism by your transaction partners. You must be able to write a contract that covers all potential events that may happen, and you must be also able to specify what you want, what compensation you want, and what adaptation you want should those events exist. That's impossible given bounded rationality. There is a couple of other problems with court enforcement of transaction, and one of them is that many infringement or behaviors that are not in the spirit of the contract are very difficult to explain to a third party. So the party has not actually played and not actually lived to the substance of the contract, to the spirit of the contract, but you cannot prove it to somebody who is external and may not have detailed knowledge of the industry and of the circumstances. The second problem is that when you go to a court, you basically divulge all kind of information which you may not want other people to know, especially your competitors. And then thirdly, courts basically award damages, they don't repair transactions. So they're a bit like divorce lawyers as opposed to marriage counselors. Very often what you want is a marriage counselor, not a divorce lawyer. So either bilateral or multilateral enforcement of governance through relationship, through reputation effects, is in fact much more flexible. It allows you, especially in bilateral governance, to repair the contract and to get redress to behavior that you think are not correct from your partner without actually breaking the transactions. So this has a lot of advantages, and multilateral governance as well has the same advantage. It also means, in a case of multilateral governance, that you basically can appeal to the remaining members of the network, which are insiders as opposed to outsiders, as would be the case with judges. So what it means is that if you have, in fact, relation-based enforcement of transaction as opposed to court-based enforcement of transactions, there are a number of implications of this. And one of them is that, for example, in the case of multilateral governance, this works if the group is stable and homogeneous, which means that in countries which actually pursue relation-based governance, typically there is a strong preference with dealing with people already in a network as opposed to admitting people from outside the networks. This explains the difficulty that Western firms, for example, have in countries like Japan or China, because they are basically outsiders. And no offer of cheaper terms or cheaper cost or better terms actually works in those circumstances, given the fact that for people in the network, an outsider is somebody who is very difficult to control, and therefore more, for them at least, from their point of view, much more likely to cheat. The second very interesting implication of multilateral network-based governance is the fact that typically relationship with insiders will persist beyond their useful life. So you see, for example, I've looked at Japanese investment in the US, you see Japanese keeping investment in the US, being very, very reluctant to close subsidiaries because of the relationship they have with their workers. And that's very different from, say, what a Dutch firm or an American firm would do. The third one is also the preference of governments in many countries where relation-based governance exists, the preference of countries to give new projects to insiders as opposed to outsiders. And I think that accounts to a very large extent for the fact that you see in many countries, existing business group being given access to new businesses. So when, for example, Korea decides they're going to go big into semiconductors, who do they talk to? LG and Samsung. They basically do not take newcomers as responsible for doing this. One other implication, which is quite striking, is that in countries which have relation-based governance, there is really no difference between personal relationships and business relationships. And this is very, very different from, for example, what happens in the US, where people make a big difference between sometimes the ethics of personal relationship and those of business relationships. And you hear things such as, well, this is business, right? So I don't have to apply the same ethical standards to business relationship than I apply to personal relationship. And there's a very interesting article by Williamson in which he says, business relationships do not have any trust components. Only personal relationships have trust components. Well, in many countries, business relationships and personal relationships are very similar. They're very intermingled. So you can see here that once you confront a theory developed in one particular context to a context which is very different, this actually gives you the possibility to make a theory much more general, because now you see what are the boundary conditions, which are the implicit boundary conditions of a theory developed in a particular cultural context. When you confront it to the reality in a different cultural context, you can then have a much more general view of what the theory is about. And the proof of that is that actually, with the theory of multilateral relation-based governance, you can explain why, in fact, in some US context, you do have, in spite of the existence of rule, of courts and of contracts and tradition of contracts, you do have, in fact, some relationships which are governed in the US through relation-based governance, either bilateral relation-based governance or multilateral relation-based governance.
I think we may have a question from the audience now. Please, who would like to ask a question? A general one or targeted at one of the panelists? Go ahead. We are here for you. Yes. Can you speak up? It's really difficult to hear. So if I understood you correctly, you were wondering, we have eclectic large theories that are aiming at explaining almost everything. And then we also work with narrower theories that are more limited in scope and in terms of their explanatory power. And were you wondering how they relate to each other? Is a discussion. Comments from the panelists? Who would like to take this comment? Mark, would you like to comment on large eclectic theories versus narrower, smaller ones? And welcome, lovely to see you.
I'm sorry about this. I'm obviously an hour out compared to everybody else. So I thought I was early and I discover I'm late. Okay, yes, I mean, I'm a big fan of the big picture theories, because I think that one explanation for a lot of things is better than lots of separate explanations for lots of little things. And I think that one of the key features of a sort of grand theory is that it deals with basic questions like, either why do certain things exist and others not? So why do we have firms? Why do we have markets? We need some theory that explains that these somehow add value or are efficient or make life better for a majority of people, not necessarily though for everyone. And then we have patterns we observe, like certain types of multinational headquartered in certain countries seem to invest in certain industries and in certain countries. So we see these patterns. So we want an explanation, firstly, of why institutions exist, and then why they behave as they do. And I think that having a small number of reasonably comprehensive theories is much better than a proliferation of very partial theories. So I think we should put our energy more into improving grand theory rather than proliferating special theories.
Thank you very much, Mark. Ruth, would you like to comment on that? And if there are more questions, we also have the microphone here.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I was trying to look at the exact name of Robert Merton, like the strain theory, deviance theory. So my answer to your question is that they there are theories for different things, different social phenomena, and it's a matter of setting the boundaries exactly and identifying the concepts, and then looking for the relationships between those concepts that link those concepts, which usually it's called the mechanisms. So there are meta theories, and there are theories embedded in other theories, like the grand theories of Marxism, or so it depends on what you're trying to explain. The theory will have different boundaries and different general external validity, etc. So that would be, I would keep it very open, but it's very important to have the definitions, the boundaries, and then to try to be parsimonious on what you're trying to explain, because you cannot explain everything, right? So that would be my advice.
Do we have another question from the audience? Yes, please.
Ahora.
Now? Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, and thank you for such interesting presentation and comments. I was very much looking forward to participate in this session because we have a lot of discussion within our project about whether the business model can be considered a theory or not. And senior scholars argue a lot about it, and they have their own views. So if we are looking at these definitions that you are presenting, for example, that theory is about understanding rather than explanation, or on the other side, if we look at relationship between the concept within some defined frame, so we can look at the business model as an explanation, for example, how it creates value. So my question is, in that case, what makes the theory that we consider a theory in the generalized terms? If I consider something a theory, how would it become the theory on the general level?
Okay, so I think the question, the question from the audience is, what makes a theory? So a theory has to be generalizable beyond the case study, like beyond that empirical setting. Is that what you're asking, right? And what makes a theory generalizable? All right, so, just kind of thinking off my cuff here, I would say a theory has to have two conditions at least, and I'm sure that they'll complement, but one is that it has to be testable. So you can test it in this empirical setting, but you should be able to, you should at least be able to test it. So that's one. And the second one, it has to be useful, like it has to be something informative. That sounds very simple, but it's not that simple actually. So I'll turn it over to Rebecca.
Catherine, would you like to answer this one about the generalizability of theory? Thanks for a wonderful question, by the way.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, that's good. And I could actually hear the question too, so that was very useful. Yes, so I'd echo what Ruth said, but add to that first of all, when we're talking about generalities, we're talking about concepts, we're talking about conceptualizations. Often when people think about generalities, they're thinking of empirical regularities, how often something appears in the world. But when we're talking about theory, above all, we're talking about how we abstract away from what's around us and try to make sense of it. In other words, in the end, theories are about concepts, abstractions, and the way we model the universe. And we know, even though we know that, yes, you can test theory. We also know that any abstraction, any simplification of the world is going to fall short. It's always going to be wrong in some respect. It's always going to be limited in some respect. And so that's the other element that we have to keep in mind. We're never going to be able to explain everything with a single theory, and any single theory is never going to be enough. So this is where plurality is also important to guide us in understanding the world. So basically what I'm saying is that when we're talking about theory, the generalities we are talking about are our conceptions of the world.
And maybe to add to that, theories are also bound by time. So they are products of their time. And when the world changes, the theory doesn't always pick up that change. So we do have theories in IB that sort of are out of sync with the reality that we see around us. Any other questions? I know it's getting late, but Jaime has a question, please.
Yes, you were introducing, I think that both you and Catherine, I think that you were describing different notions of theory as explanation, theory as understanding, emancipation, so on. And then there is this very famous paper, What Theory is Not, by Sutton. And then at the end, he tries to summarize what a theory is. He's got this idea of theory as explanation, and he says, theory is the answer to a why question. Is this definition of theory also applicable to these alternative conceptions, interpretative or critical theory? Is something that why is also as important as in the traditional positivist notion of theory?
That's a difficult question. So Jaime Bonacci here is asking about the how and why questions. So in case study research, if I heard you right, Yin, for example, advocates that we need to answer the how and why question, and now you're asking, well, how relevant is the why question for people who are perhaps doing more interpretivist kind of research that Catherine introduced here. And yes, we know that a number of qualitative researchers would shy away from the why question and say that they are not explaining, they are understanding the phenomenon. And this is a long-standing debate in philosophy of science and not always recognized in IB, actually. So any additions from the panelists? We could take one more question from the audience if Catherine, would you like to add there? Go ahead.
Yes, just to say that in these debates, words become very important. And one of the long-standing traditions is this distinction between explanation and understanding. But explanation is often regarded as being, as you saw from the Sutton and Storr definition, as being causal. And it's the specific notion of causality that is often prevalent in some traditions that the interpretivists have trouble with. But if you expand the notion of what is explanation, then you could say that interpretists also explain the world, because in the end, that's what we're trying to do. So I presented Sutton and Storr as being hopefully a more unifying definition of theory that many traditions would be able to subscribe to.
Thank you for the question and the answers. Now, it is getting both dark and late here, and I think we have only scratched the surface. This is a start, hopefully, of a conversation that will continue at the next EIBA conference. But maybe one takeaway to leave you with is that what we have hoped to achieve with this brief discussion is to show you a diversity of views on theory. And Ruth didn't have the time to present her work on configurational theorizing as an alternative to correlational theorizing, which dominates much of the international business research. Catherine wanted to present you with process theory and theorizing, which we didn't have time to do either. But hopefully you'll see that the word theory is laden. It's definitely not neutral. And it is good to understand when you engage with colleagues from where they are coming, given the multidisciplinary background of our field. And why this topic matters? Well, it matters because our assumptions about theory affect the kind of theories we produce, so the output of our work, as well as the way we go about producing them, the methodologies that we use. Theory and method are closely intertwined, and that's one of the messages that we hope to leave you with, the idea that we are fortunate to be in a field where we have this pluralism of views of theory, and that should be a richness rather than a barrier. We are not aiming here to get at consensus, but rather open up the diversity. So let me thank our online panelists, as well as Ruth, who is here with me, and the wonderful audience that came at this late hour to discuss this with us. We hope that you've gained something for your own work, and look forward to meeting you tomorrow as the conference continues. So thank you, Jeremy, Jean-Francois, Catherine, and Mark a lot for joining, as well as our PhD students.